Picture this. You've spent 12 years serving your country in the most elite military unit in the world, sacrificing everything for missions you can never talk about, only to come home and discover your own family has betrayed you in ways that would make your worst enemies blush. What started as a simple inheritance dispute turned into a federal investigation that exposed a web of fraud so deep it reached all the way to international money laundering. This is the story of how my parents chose their golden child over their war hero son, and how they learned the hard way that you should never underestimate a Navy SEAL. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as I stepped out of the rideshare vehicle, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and my discharge papers still crisp in my back pocket. The heat was different from the desert missions I'd grown accustomed to. This was home, or at least it was supposed to be. The irony wasn't lost on me that after surviving classified operations in some of the world's most dangerous territories, I felt more nervous walking up the familiar stone pathway to my childhood home than I had during any midnight raid. Scottsdale looked exactly the same as when I'd left for my final deployment 18 months ago. The palm trees still swayed gently in the desert breeze, and the manicured lawns still defied nature with their emerald perfection. What I didn't expect was the massive iron gate that now blocked the entrance to what had been my grandmother's estate. Elena Thompson had raised me in this house after my parents divorced when I was 8, and when she passed 3 years ago, she'd left everything to me in her will. At least, that's what I remembered. I pressed the intercom button beside the new security system, noting the expensive cameras that tracked my every movement. The voice that crackled through the speaker made my blood run cold. It was my sister Jessica, but her tone was pure ice. "Can I help you?" she said, as if she didn't recognize the voice of her own brother. "Jess, it's Marcus. I'm home." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Through the ornate bars of the gate, I could see the house where I'd spent my teenage years, where Grandma Elena had taught me to be a man of honor and integrity. The swimming pool where I'd learned to hold my breath for impossible amounts of time still sparkled in the afternoon sun, though now it was surrounded by new outdoor furniture that cost more than most people's cars. "Marcus Thompson?" Jessica's voice returned, but there was something calculated about her surprise. "What are you doing here?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. What was I doing here? I was coming home to the property my grandmother had left me, to the place where I'd planned to start my civilian life, to decompress from years of operations that still haunted my dreams. "I'm coming home, Jess. Can you open the gate?" "This isn't your home anymore, Marcus. You've been gone for years. Things have changed." Before I could respond, I heard her speaking to someone else in the background, a male voice I recognized as her husband Carlos. Their conversation was muffled, but I caught enough words to understand they were discussing whether to call someone. The word police drifted through the intercom, and suddenly everything clicked into place with military precision. Something was very, very wrong. I'd been trained to read situations, to assess threats, and to trust my instincts. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming that this wasn't just a family misunderstanding. The security system, the way Jessica spoke to me like a stranger, the panicked conversation in the background, this was a coordinated response. "Jessica, I need you to open this gate. Grandma Elena left this property to me, and you know it." "Actually, Marcus, that's where you're wrong." Her voice had shifted from surprise to coldly professional. "The property belongs to Carlos and me. Now, we have all the legal documentation. You're trespassing." The word trespassing echoed in my mind as I stared at the house where I'd celebrated my high school graduation, where I'd announced my decision to join the Navy, where my grandmother had hugged me goodbye before my first deployment with tears in her eyes and pride in her voice. I could see movement behind the windows now. My father Robert appeared briefly in the living room, his silhouette unmistakable even from a distance. He looked directly at me through the glass, our eyes meeting for a brief moment before he deliberately turned his back and walked away. The message was clear. I was not welcome. The sound of sirens in the distance made my stomach drop. They'd actually called the police on their own son, their own brother. As a black and white Scottsdale PD cruiser rounded the corner, I realized this wasn't just about property or money. This was about something much bigger, something that required the kind of systematic thinking I'd learned in special operations. Two officers stepped out of the patrol car, their hands resting casually on their duty belts. The older one, a sergeant with graying temples, approached me with the cautious respect reserved for someone in uniform. Even though I was wearing civilian clothes, something about my bearing must have triggered his recognition. "Sir, we got a call about someone attempting to gain unauthorized access to this property. Can I see some identification?" I handed over my military ID along with my Arizona driver's license, watching his expression change as he processed the information. "Marcus Thompson, Navy Petty Officer. Wait, this says you're stationed at..." "Recently discharged, Sergeant. This is my grandmother's house, Elena Thompson. She passed 3 years ago and left the property to me in her will." The younger officer was already speaking into his radio, running my information through their system. Meanwhile, Jessica had appeared at an upstairs window, her phone pressed to her ear, watching the scene unfold with the satisfaction of someone who'd planned this moment carefully. As I stood there in the blazing Arizona heat, surrounded by police officers at the gate of my childhood home, one thought crystallized in my mind with absolute clarity. If my family wanted to play games, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I hadn't survived 12 years as a Navy SEAL by backing down from a fight, and I certainly wasn't going to start now. __blank. The sergeant's radio crackled with static as dispatch confirmed what I already knew. There was no active warrant for my arrest, no restraining order, nothing that would legally prevent me from being here. But what came next made my blood run cold. "Sir, according to our records, this property is registered to Jessica Thompson Martinez and Carlos Martinez. There's no record of a Marcus Thompson having any legal claim to this address." I felt like I'd been hit by an IED blast. The words hung in the desert air, distorting reality the way heat waves bend light off asphalt. No legal claim. How was that possible? I'd seen the will myself when Grandma Elena died. I'd been overseas during the funeral, but I'd received copies of all the documentation through my family lawyer at the time. "That's impossible," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos erupting in my mind. "I have documentation proving my inheritance claim." The younger officer stepped forward, his notebook already out. "Do you have those documents with you, sir?" I didn't. Everything was in storage back at the base, scattered across the chaos of a military discharge that had happened faster than expected due to a training injury that ended my career. I'd trusted that my family would honor what my grandmother had wanted. The naivete of that assumption was becoming crystal clear. Jessica had moved from the upstairs window to the front door, which she now opened just wide enough to speak through the gap. "Officers, I appreciate you responding so quickly. This man has been harassing our family for months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Claiming he owns property that legally belongs to my husband and me. We've tried to be patient because of his condition. But enough is enough. Condition." The word hit me like a sniper's bullet, precise and devastating. She was referring to the PTSD diagnosis that had contributed to my medical discharge, the invisible wounds that I'd been working through with VA counselors. She was weaponizing my service-related injuries against me. "Ma'am, what kind of harassment are we talking about?" the sergeant asked, his pen poised over his citation book. "Phone calls at all hours, showing up unannounced, threatening legal action over property that was legally transferred to us years ago. He's been making my elderly parents' lives miserable with these delusions." Every word was carefully chosen, designed to paint me as an unstable veteran with a tenuous grip on reality. The officers were starting to look at me differently now, their initial respect giving way to the cautious concern reserved for someone who might be having a mental health crisis. "Marcus," Jessica continued, her voice taking on a tone of practiced concern, "we've talked about this. The property was transferred to Carlos and me when Grandma became ill. She wanted to make sure it stayed in the family, with people who could actually take care of it. You were overseas, remember? You couldn't even come to her funeral." The accusation stung, because it contained just enough truth to be believable. I had been overseas during her final months on a classified mission that I couldn't abandon, I'd missed her funeral because duty came first. It always had. But the idea that she would have changed her will, that she would have cut me out entirely, felt like a betrayal of everything I thought I knew about the woman who'd raised me. "Sir," the older officer said, his tone gentler now, "is it possible there's been some misunderstanding about the inheritance? Sometimes families handle these things differently than what we might expect." I looked through the iron bars at the house where I'd learned to shoot, where Grandma Elena had taught me about honor and sacrifice, where she'd told me stories about my grandfather's service in Vietnam. The rose garden she'd tended every morning was still there, but someone had added a fountain that definitely hadn't been in her modest budget. "No misunderstanding," I said firmly. "But I need to gather my documentation before we can resolve this properly." Carlos appeared behind Jessica, his arms snaking around her waist in a gesture that seemed more possessive than comforting. He was exactly the type of man I'd expected her to marry: expensive watch, perfectly styled hair, and the kind of artificial confidence that comes from never having faced real adversity. "Officers," Carlos said, his slight accent adding weight to his words, "perhaps it would be best if Marcus sought some professional help. The transition from military to civilian life can be very difficult, and sometimes veterans struggle with reality versus what they think they remember." The condescension in his voice made my jaw clench. This wasn't random cruelty, this was strategic. They weren't just denying my claim to the property, they were systematically undermining my credibility as a witness to their fraud. Because that's what this was starting to feel like: fraud on a scale that required planning and coordination. "I'll need to see those documents you mentioned," the sergeant said to me. "Until then, I have to ask you to leave the property. If you have a legitimate legal claim, you'll need to work through the courts." As I walked back toward the street, I could hear Jessica and Carlos speaking in low voices behind the partially closed door. My hearing had been enhanced through years of training to pick up conversations that others might miss, and what I caught made my blood freeze. "How long before the transfer is complete?" Jessica's voice carried just enough on the desert breeze. "End of the month, if everything stays quiet," Carlos replied. "But if he starts digging, he won't find anything. We made sure of that." I kept walking, my face betraying nothing, but my mind was already shifting into operational mode. This wasn't grief or family dysfunction. This was a crime in progress. They weren't just occupying my grandmother's house. They were in the process of stealing it entirely. And they'd been planning this for months, possibly years. The rideshare driver who'd brought me from the airport was long gone, so I started walking toward the main road, my duffel bag growing heavier with each step. The heat was brutal, but I'd endured worse. What bothered me more was the feeling of being completely alone in hostile territory, except this time the enemy wasn't wearing uniforms or carrying Alaska 47s. They were wearing my family's faces. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw what happened at the house. If you're the real Marcus Thompson, meet me at Desert Moon Cafe on Camelback at 7 p.m. Come alone. I have information you need." I stopped walking and read the message 3 more times. Someone had been watching. Someone knew more than they were letting on. In my experience, anonymous contacts usually fell into 2 categories: people who wanted to help and people who wanted to hurt you. The only way to find out which was to show up. The Desert Moon Cafe was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find in Scottsdale. Overpriced coffee, abstract art on the walls, and clientele that looked like they'd never worked a day of manual labor in their lives. I arrived early, chose a table with clear sightlines to all entrances, and waited. Amanda Chen appeared at exactly 7 o'clock, and I recognized her immediately, despite the 15 years that had passed since high school. She'd been valedictorian, editor of the school newspaper, and one of the few people who'd treated me like a human being instead of just another jock destined for military service. "Marcus Thompson," she said, extending her hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I heard you were back in town. Amanda, I wasn't expecting to see you here. I'm a lawyer now, estate planning, mostly, with some criminal defense work on the side. And right now, I think you need both." She sat down across from me, pulling out a tablet that she set between us like evidence in a trial. I've been following your family's legal activities for the past 2 years, ever since your grandmother's estate went through probate. What I found made me sick to my stomach. The screen showed a series of documents, property transfers, bank statements, and legal filings that painted a picture of systematic fraud. My grandmother's will had indeed left everything to me, but 6 months after her death, while I was deployed and unreachable, a series of legal maneuvers had transferred the property to Jessica and Carlos. This, Amanda said, pointing to a particular document, is a power of attorney agreement supposedly signed by you, giving Jessica the right to make financial decisions on your behalf while you were overseas. I studied my apparent signature at the bottom of the page. It was close, but not perfect. Someone had practiced, but they hadn't accounted for the subtle changes in my handwriting that had developed after a shrapnel injury to my right hand 2 years earlier. I never signed this. I know, and this, she continued, scrolling to another document, is a quitclaim deed transferring your inheritance rights to your sister. Also, supposedly signed by you, also forged. The scope of the deception was staggering. They hadn't just stolen my property. They'd created an entire paper trail, making it look like I'd voluntarily given it away. The level of planning required suggested this went far beyond simple family greed. Amanda, how did you get access to these documents? She smiled grimly. Your sister hired my firm to handle the legal work. She wanted everything to look completely legitimate. What she didn't count on was me recognizing your name and doing some digging on my own time. Why are you helping me? Because I remember the kid who stood up to bullies in high school, even when it cost you. And because what they've done isn't just fraud. It's identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. These are federal crimes, Marcus. I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications. This wasn't just about getting my grandmother's house back. This was about exposing a criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cover of family dysfunction. There's more, Amanda continued. The property isn't just being lived in, it's being used for something else. I've noticed unusual activity patterns, vehicles coming and going at odd hours, and financial transfers that don't match Carlos's declared income from his import business. What kind of unusual activity? The kind that suggests your grandmother's house has become a storage and distribution point for Carlos's import operation. I think they needed a legitimate residential address for customs purposes, and stealing your inheritance gave them the perfect cover. As Amanda talked, I found myself slipping back into the analytical mindset that had kept me alive through countless missions. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, and the pattern suggested that my family's betrayal was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. I need to see those activity reports, I said. I was hoping you'd say that, but Marcus, you need to understand. If we pursue this, they're going to fight back hard. They've invested too much in this scheme to just walk away quietly. I thought about Jessica's performance with the police officers, the way she'd weaponized my PTSD diagnosis, the calculated cruelty of calling me delusional. They'd already declared war. I was just finally recognizing the battlefield. Let them fight, I said. They have no idea what they're up against. Amanda's smile was sharp as a blade. That's what I was hoping you'd say, because tomorrow we start gathering evidence. And I have a feeling they've made more mistakes than they realize. As we left the cafe, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my discharge, a sense of purpose. For the first time in months, I had a mission that mattered, an enemy that deserved to be defeated, and allies I could trust. My family thought they'd targeted a broken veteran struggling with civilian life. They were about to learn they'd picked a fight with a Navy SEAL. Blank, underscore, blank. The next morning, I sat in Amanda's law office downtown, surrounded by boxes of legal documents that told the story of my family's systematic theft in excruciating detail. The air conditioning hummed quietly while outside. Phoenix was already climbing toward another triple-digit day. Amanda had arrived at 6 a.m. with coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and a determination that reminded me why I'd respected her in high school. The first thing we need to establish, she said, spreading photographs across her desk, is that you never had any communication with your family about transferring your inheritance. No emails, no phone calls, no text messages that could be interpreted as consent. I scrolled through my phone's message history, going back years. Nothing. The last conversation I had with Jessica was 2 Christmases ago, and that was just holiday pleasantries. Before that, maybe a birthday text here and there. Good. That makes their forgery even more blatant. Amanda pulled up a digital copy of the power of attorney document on her computer screen. Look at this signature line. They used a document from your military personnel file, probably something Jessica obtained when she was listed as your emergency contact. The realization hit me like ice water. When I'd first enlisted, I'd listed Jessica as my emergency contact because our parents were going through their messy divorce. She'd had access to my personal information for over a decade, including examples of my signature from various military forms. She's been planning this since I enlisted, I said, the scope of the betrayal settling into my bones. It gets worse. I ran a property search on your grandmother's estate. The transfer to Jessica and Carlos wasn't just about taking your inheritance. It was about debt consolidation. Carlos's import business was hemorrhaging money, and they needed collateral for a massive loan. Amanda showed me bank records that painted a picture of financial desperation. Carlos's company, Desert Ventures Inc., had been bleeding cash for 2 years. Import licenses, customs fees, and storage costs had created a spiral of debt that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. Your grandmother's house became their lifeline, Amanda continued. Free and clear property worth $1.8 million. Perfect for securing the loans they needed to stay afloat. They just had to eliminate the rightful owner first. Which explains the timing, I said. They waited until I was deployed and unreachable, then moved fast while I couldn't object. Exactly. And there's something else. Amanda's voice dropped to a whisper, despite the privacy of her office. I think your parents were involved from the beginning. She pulled out a manila folder marked, quote, Thompson Family Communications, and spread its contents across the desk. Email printouts, text message screenshots, and handwritten notes revealed a conspiracy that went far deeper than sibling rivalry. These are communications between your mother Linda and Jessica over the past 3 years. Look at this one, dated 6 months before your grandmother's death. Amanda pointed to an email thread that made my stomach turn. Linda Thompson to Jessica Thompson Martinez. Mom's been asking about Marcus again. Says she wants to make sure he's taken care of when she's gone. We need to discuss options before she does something we'll all regret. Jessica Thompson Martinez to Linda Thompson. Carlos says there are legal ways to handle this. Mom doesn't understand Marcus's situation. He's not stable enough to manage property. We'd actually be doing him a favor. Linda Thompson to Jessica Thompson Martinez. Your father agrees. Marcus chose the military over family. He can't expect to come back and claim what people who stayed behind have worked to maintain. The emails continued for months, documenting a gradual escalation from concern to conspiracy. They'd convinced themselves that stealing my inheritance was actually an act of mercy, protecting an unstable veteran from responsibilities he couldn't handle. They gaslit themselves into believing their own lie, I said, recognizing the psychological manipulation tactics I'd studied during CRE training. Classic rationalization pattern. But here's where it gets criminal. Amanda opened another folder, this one thick with financial documents. 6 weeks ago, Carlos used your forged signature to apply for a federal small business loan, claiming veteran ownership of Desert Ventures Inc. The document showed my name listed as a 50% owner of Carlos's import company, complete with my military service record and security clearance information. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd stolen my identity to commit federal fraud. This is a federal crime, I said, my voice deadly calm. Multiple federal crimes. Identity theft, fraud, forgery, and potentially money laundering, if we can prove they're moving illicit funds through the business. Amanda's eyes gleamed with prosecutorial hunger. But we need more evidence before we go to the authorities. Right now, it's your word against a coordinated family narrative. What kind of evidence? The kind that requires getting close to their operation without them knowing. We need financial records, communication intercepts, and documentation of whatever they're really doing with that property. I leaned back in my chair, my mind automatically shifting into mission planning mode. Surveillance, intelligence gathering, evidence collection. This was exactly the type of operation I'd run dozens of times overseas, except now the target was my own family. I can do that, I said, but I'll need operational support. Amanda raised an eyebrow. What kind of operational support? People who understand digital forensics, financial crimes, and surveillance techniques. I know some people who might be willing to help. That afternoon, I sat in a small park near Tempe Town Lake, watching children play on swings while I waited for my contacts to arrive. Jake Sullivan appeared first, looking exactly like what he was, a recently retired Navy SEAL trying to adjust to civilian clothes that still looked uncomfortable on his massive frame. We'd served together for 6 years, and he'd saved my life more times than either of us cared to count. "Marcus, brother, you look like hell," he said, dropping onto the bench beside me. "Feel worse. Thanks for coming out on short notice." "You kidding? Phoenix in August? This is practically a vacation." His grin faded as he studied my face. "What's the situation?" I briefed him on the family betrayal, the forged documents, and the federal fraud while he listened with the intense focus that had made him one of the best intelligence analysts in the teams. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So your sister and her husband stole your inheritance and are using your identity to commit federal crimes," he summarized. "That's the short version. And you want to run a domestic surveillance operation to gather evidence." "That's the plan." Jake nodded slowly. "You know this could go sideways fast if they realize what you're doing." "I know, but they made one critical mistake. They assumed I'd just disappear quietly. They're about to learn why that assumption was wrong." Riley Parker arrived 20 minutes later, parking her motorcycle with the precision of someone who'd learned to drive in Baghdad traffic. She'd been our communications specialist, equally comfortable with cutting-edge electronics and ancient radio equipment. Her transition to civilian life had involved starting a private security consulting firm that specialized in corporate espionage prevention. "Thompson," she said, pulling off her helmet and revealing the short black hair that had become her trademark. "Heard you were having family problems." "The kind that require professional assistance," I replied. She listened to my briefing with the analytical detachment that had made her invaluable during our deployments. When I finished explaining the situation, she pulled out a tablet and started taking notes. "Financial fraud, identity theft, and property theft," she mused. "Plus whatever import business they're really running. This is going to require a multi-vector approach. What are you thinking?" "Electronic surveillance first. If they're communicating about their criminal activity, they're probably doing it through digital channels they think are secure. I can set up monitoring on their phones, email accounts, and home network." Jake leaned forward. "What about physical surveillance? If they're using the property for import storage, we need to document the traffic patterns." "Already thought of that," Riley said. "But we need to be careful. If they spot us watching the house, they'll know we're onto them." "They won't spot us," I said with confidence, born from years of experience. "We're not dealing with trained operatives here. We're dealing with criminals who got lucky and think they're smarter than they are." Riley's grin was predatory. "I like this plan already. When do we start?" "Tonight. Riley, I need you to establish electronic surveillance on their communications. Jake, I want you to set up observation posts around the property. I'm going to pay a visit to my parents and see what they know about this operation." "What if they refuse to talk to you?" Jake asked. "They'll talk. Trust me." As the sun began to set over the Valley of the Sun, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of tracer rounds, I felt the familiar calm that came before a mission. For the first time since my discharge, I had a clear objective: a competent team and enemies who deserved whatever was coming to them. My parents lived in a modest ranch house in Ahwatukee, a far cry from the Scottsdale estate they'd helped steal from me. I knocked on the front door at exactly 8 p.m., knowing they'd be finishing dinner and settling in for their evening routine. Linda Thompson opened the door with a smile that died the moment she saw my face. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Mom, about Grandma Elena's house." "I don't think that's a good idea," she said, starting to close the door. I placed my hand against the frame. Not aggressively, but firmly enough to stop her motion. It wasn't a request. Robert Thompson appeared behind her, his face already flushed with the anger I remembered from childhood. "You need to leave, Marcus. You're not welcome here." "Interesting family policy," I said, stepping inside despite their protests. "First Jessica calls the cops on me, now you're throwing me out. All over property that legally belongs to me." "That property belongs to Jessica and Carlos now," Linda said, her voice shaking. "Elena changed her mind before she died. She realized you weren't stable enough to handle that kind of responsibility." "Funny thing about that story, Mom, I've seen the documentation. Every signature, every legal transfer, every piece of paperwork. Would you like to guess what I found?" The color drained from both their faces, but Robert recovered first, puffing up with manufactured indignation. "You're threatening your own parents now? This is exactly why Elena made the right choice." "I'm not threatening anyone, I'm stating facts. Jessica forged my signature on legal documents. Carlos used my identity to commit federal fraud. And you two helped them plan the whole thing." Linda sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "We were trying to protect you. You came back from overseas different, damaged. We thought it would be better if family members who could actually manage the property took responsibility for it. So you stole it." "We preserved it," Robert snapped, "for the family, for people who actually stayed here and built something instead of running off to play soldier." The dismissal of my military service hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Playing soldier. 12 years of classified operations, of friends who died in my arms, of missions that had kept American citizens safe while they slept peacefully in their suburban homes. Reduced to playing soldier. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd used when giving orders to my team. "You're going to call Jessica and Carlos right now. You're going to tell them I've been here, and you're going to tell them exactly what I said. Every word." "We're not doing anything," Robert said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Yes, you are, because if you don't, I'm going straight to the FBI field office downtown, and I'm going to tell them everything I know about your little family conspiracy. Federal agents tend to take a dim view of people who defraud veterans." Linda was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streams. "Marcus, please, we're family." "No," I said, walking toward the door. "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't forge documents and commit federal crimes. You stopped being my family the moment you decided my service meant nothing." I left them sitting in their living room, probably already reaching for their phones to warn Jessica and Carlos that their carefully constructed lie was falling apart, which was exactly what I wanted them to do. Because sometimes the best way to catch a criminal is to let them know you're coming. Mac blank underscore blank. At 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Riley. "Electronic package delivered. Full spectrum monitoring active." They're panicking. The green glow of the screen illuminated my rental car as I sat in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, maintaining visual contact with the access road leading to my grandmother's estate. Jake was positioned on the opposite side of the property, using night vision equipment to monitor the rear entrance that backed up to the desert preserve. The beauty of psychological warfare is that once your enemy knows they're being hunted, they start making mistakes. Desperate people do desperate things, and desperate things leave evidence trails that trained investigators can follow, like breadcrumbs back to the source. My parents had indeed made their phone calls, exactly as I'd predicted. Riley's surveillance equipment had captured everything: frantic conversations between Linda and Jessica, heated arguments between Carlos and Robert, and most importantly, a series of text messages that revealed the true scope of their criminal enterprise. Riley's voice crackled through my earpiece. "You need to hear this. Carlos just called someone named Miguel Santos. Audio quality is perfect." The recorded conversation played through my secure phone with crystal clarity. Carlos's voice was tight with stress as he spoke in rapid Spanish. then switched to English when his contact apparently didn't understand. "The package delivery schedule needs to be moved up," Carlos said. "We have a problem with the property owner situation." "What kind of problem?" The other voice had a slight accent, professional but cautious. "The military guy is back and asking questions. We need to clear out the inventory before he can cause trouble." "How much inventory are we talking about?" 3 months' worth. Maybe 4. "It's all properly documented for customs, but if someone starts looking too closely at the residential storage arrangement..." The line went quiet for a moment before the other voice responded. "That's a lot of merchandise to move quickly. It's gonna cost extra. Whatever it costs, just get it done. I'll have the vehicles ready by tomorrow night." The call ended, leaving me with a dozen new questions and one inescapable conclusion. My grandmother's house wasn't just being used as collateral for Carlos's failing business. It was being used as a distribution hub for something that required careful customs documentation and discreet storage. Something valuable enough that the prospect of discovery was causing panic in their organization. Jake's voice came through the comm system. Movement at the rear gate. Black panel van, no front license plate visible. 2 occupants. I started my car and drove slowly toward the estate, staying far enough back to avoid detection while maintaining visual contact. The van pulled into the circular driveway and backed up to the garage, a maneuver that suggested familiarity with the property layout. "Riley, are you getting this?" "Every pixel. The van's rear plate is registered to Santos Import Solutions. Checking the database now." A pause as she ran the information through her network of contacts. "Marcus, this is interesting. Santos Import Solutions has been flagged by Customs and Border Protection for unusual shipping patterns. Nothing prosecutable, but enough to put them on the watch list." Through my binoculars, I watched 2 men in work clothes begin unloading wooden crates from the van. The crates were uniform in size, professionally marked with shipping labels, and handled with the kind of care reserved for fragile or valuable items. Jessica appeared from the house wearing jeans and a work shirt, directing the men toward what used to be my grandmother's rose garden shed. "Jake, can you get closer to the shed without compromising your position?" "Already moving. Give me 5 minutes." While Jake repositioned himself, I called Amanda on her emergency number. She answered on the second ring, sounding fully awake despite the early hour. "Please tell me you have good news," she said without preamble. "Better than good. We have documented evidence of ongoing criminal activity at the property. Import violations, federal fraud, and enough conspiracy charges to put them away for decades." "What kind of evidence?" "Recorded phone conversations, surveillance footage of suspicious deliveries, and financial records showing fraudulent use of my identity for federal loan applications." "How quickly can you get a federal prosecutor involved?" "If the evidence is as solid as you say, I can have someone from the U.S. Attorney's Office on the phone within hours. But Marcus, we need to be careful about how we obtained this information. Illegally gathered evidence won't hold up in court. Everything we've collected falls under legal surveillance guidelines. Private property observation from public areas, electronic monitoring with proper consent, and financial record analysis through legitimate channels." Amanda was quiet for a moment, processing the legal implications. "This could work, but we need one more piece. Direct evidence of the federal fraud. Something that proves Carlos knowingly used your identity for the loan application." "Leave that to me," Jake's voice interrupted through my earpiece. "Marcus, you need to see this. I'm transmitting video now." My phone screen lit up with night vision footage from Jake's position. The wooden crates were being stored in what had been converted into a climate-controlled warehouse space. But more importantly, Jessica was supervising the operation while Carlos handled paperwork with one of the delivery men. The paperwork exchange was being recorded in high definition. "That's our smoking gun," I told Amanda. "Carlos conducting business operations at the property using my forged identity. We have him dead to rights. I'll start drafting the federal complaint." "How soon can you get me those recordings?" 2 hours. Riley's already preparing the encrypted files. As the van finished unloading and prepared to leave, I made a decision that would have been considered reckless by anyone who didn't understand psychological warfare. I waited until the vehicle was halfway down the access road, then pulled out of my hiding spot and drove slowly past the estate with my headlights on full beam. Through the wrought iron gates, I could see Jessica and Carlos standing in the driveway, their faces clearly illuminated by my passing headlights. I wanted them to know I'd been watching. I wanted them to understand that their midnight operations weren't as secret as they thought. Jessica's phone started ringing before I'd even reached the main road. Riley's voice came through my earpiece with barely contained excitement. Emergency call from Jessica to her mother. Recording now. Mom, he was here. Marcus was watching the house during the delivery. Linda's voice was high with panic. What do you mean he was watching? I mean he drove by while Miguel's guys were unloading. He saw everything. We need to accelerate the timeline. What timeline? Jessica, what timeline? The property sale. Carlos has a buyer lined up in Mexico City. We can close within a week, if we move fast enough. Once the property's sold to an overseas buyer, Marcus won't be able to prove anything. The line went quiet as Linda processed this new information. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. You're selling the house? Elena's house? We don't have a choice anymore. Marcus is building a case against us. If we don't liquidate the assets and disappear, we're all going to prison. Prison? Jessica, what have you done? What I had to do to save this family from bankruptcy. Carlos's business was hemorrhaging money, and the only way to keep everything afloat was to use the property as collateral. But now, it's gone too far to turn back. I pulled into the parking lot of an all-night gas station and sat listening to my sister's confession with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She was admitting to everything: the forged documents, the property theft, the federal fraud, and now a planned international sale to avoid prosecution. Jake's voice interrupted my thoughts. Secondary vehicle approaching the property. Looks like a private security company. Through my binoculars, I could see a white SUV with Desert Protection Services painted on the sides. Two armed guards got out and began walking the perimeter of the property, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they checked for signs of surveillance. They're getting serious about security, I observed, which means they're getting serious about protecting whatever they're hiding, Riley replied. I'm detecting increased electronic activity from the house. They're making a lot of phone calls to international numbers. Can you trace the calls? Already on it. Most are going to numbers registered in Mexico and Colombia. Import-export businesses, shipping companies, and at least 3 that are flagged in the DEA database. The pieces were falling into place with military precision. Carlos's import business wasn't just struggling with legitimate trade, it was serving as a front for something much more lucrative and dangerous. My grandmother's house had become a storage and distribution point for an international smuggling operation, and my family's theft of my inheritance had provided the perfect cover. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Stop digging or face consequences. This is your only warning. I showed the message to Riley when I met her at our rendezvous point an hour later. She studied it with the analytical approach that had made her one of the best intelligence analysts in the Navy. Grammatical structure suggests a native English speaker trying to sound more formal than natural. Probably Carlos attempting to intimidate you. He's gonna have to do better than anonymous text messages. I think he knows that. Look at this. Riley showed me her tablet, which displayed a series of financial transfers that had occurred in the past 4 hours. Carlos is liquidating assets faster than a drug dealer fleeing a DEA raid. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, even Jessica's jewelry collection. Everything's being converted to cryptocurrency and transferred to offshore accounts. They're preparing to run. Worse than that, they're preparing to run with evidence that could implicate other people in their operation. If they get away clean, we'll never be able to prove the full scope of their crimes. Jake appeared from his surveillance position, looking like he'd spent the night crawling through desert brush, which, knowing Jake, he probably had. Security situation at the property has escalated, he reported. Armed guards, motion sensors, and at least 2 attack dogs patrolling the grounds. They're turning your grandmother's house into a fortress. How long before they can complete the property sale? I asked. Based on their phone conversations, they need 7 days to finalize the international transfer. But there's something else you should know. Jake's expression was grim. They've contacted a private military contractor about providing additional security during the transition period. The implications hit me immediately. Private military contractors meant professional security operators, possibly with military backgrounds similar to our own. The psychological advantage we'd been exploiting, their panic and inexperience, was about to disappear. We need to move fast, I said. Amanda needs those recordings immediately, and we need federal law enforcement involved before they can complete the property sale. Riley nodded, already packing her equipment. I'll have the full surveillance package ready for delivery within 2 hours. But Marcus, once we hand this over to the feds, we lose control of the timeline. They'll move when they're ready, not when we want them to. That's a risk we have to take. This has gone beyond property theft. We're looking at international money laundering, import violations, and potentially drug trafficking. My family didn't just steal my inheritance. They stumbled into a federal crime spree that's about to destroy their lives. As dawn broke over the Phoenix Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded me of safer times, I realized that the next 24 hours would determine whether my family spent their remaining years in federal prison or managed to escape to a country without extradition treaties. Either way, my grandmother's house, the place where I'd learned about honor and integrity, was about to become ground zero for a federal investigation that would expose the true cost of their betrayal. And I was going to make sure I had a front row seat when their world came crashing down. Blank, _ blank. The FBI field office in Phoenix looked exactly like every other federal building I'd ever entered. Sterile corridors, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of institutional beige paint that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who walked through its doors. But today, as I sat across from Special Agent David Rodriguez and his team of federal prosecutors, I felt nothing but anticipation. Amanda had worked through the night to prepare our evidence package, and the result was a prosecutorial masterpiece. Financial records, surveillance footage, recorded conversations, and documented federal fraud laid out in chronological order that told the story of a family's descent into criminal conspiracy. The conference room table was covered with exhibits that represented months of planning and years of betrayal. Mr. Thompson, Agent Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades putting criminals behind bars. This is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've seen in 20 years. Your family didn't just steal your inheritance. They created an entire criminal enterprise using your identity. The prosecutor beside him, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Mitchell, was scrolling through the electronic evidence on her tablet. The federal loan fraud alone carries a maximum sentence of 30 years. Add in the identity theft, money laundering, and international transfer violations, and we're looking at life sentences for the primary conspirators. What about my parents? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Conspiracy charges, at minimum. Their communications show clear knowledge of the fraud and active participation in the cover-up. They'll be looking at 10 to 15 years, depending on their cooperation level. Agent Rodriguez leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Here's what we need from you, Marcus. We want to set up a controlled meeting with your sister and Carlos. Get them to admit their crimes on tape while wearing a wire. It would seal the case and eliminate any possibility of them claiming ignorance or coercion. The idea of facing Jessica and Carlos while wearing federal surveillance equipment brought back memories of deep cover operations in hostile territory. The difference was that this time the enemy wore familiar faces and spoke with voices I'd once trusted. When do you want to do this? I asked. Today. Our surveillance teams report they're accelerating their timeline. We believe they're planning to flee the country within 48 hours. This might be our last opportunity to get them on record before they disappear. Amanda touched my arm gently. Marcus, you don't have to do this. We have enough evidence to prosecute without putting you at risk. What kind of risk are we talking about? I asked Agent Rodriguez. Your sister and Carlos have hired professional security. Former military contractors with experience in international operations. If they realize you're wearing a wire, the situation could escalate quickly. I almost laughed. Professional security contractors were exactly the kind of adversaries I'd been trained to handle. After years of operating in environments where discovery meant death, facing down a couple of hired guards seemed almost routine. I'll do it. But I want Jake and Riley providing overwatch. That's not standard protocol, Agent Rodriguez said. Neither is having a Navy SEAL as your primary witness. You want this done right, we do it my way. 2 hours later, I was sitting in an FBI surveillance van while a technician fitted me with a recording device so small it was virtually undetectable. The wire was sewn into the seam of my shirt, with a backup audio transmitter disguised as a fitness tracker on my wrist. Jake and Riley were positioned in separate vehicles with direct communication to the federal tactical team. Remember, Agent Rodriguez said through my earpiece, we need them to admit to forging your signature, using your identity for the federal loan, and planning to transfer the stolen property to international buyers. Don't push too hard. Let them incriminate themselves naturally. I'd called Jessica 20 minutes earlier, using a script approved by the federal prosecutors. I told her I wanted to meet to discuss a peaceful resolution to our family dispute. She'd agreed to meet at the Desert Moon Cafe, the same place where Amanda had first shown me evidence of their fraud. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jessica arrived 15 minutes late, dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Carlos followed her through the cafe entrance, his eyes constantly scanning the room like a man who knew he was being hunted. They chose a corner table with clear sightlines to all exits, a tactical choice that told me they'd been coached by their security team. Marcus, Jessica said as I approached their table, her voice carrying forced warmth that didn't reach her eyes. I'm glad you called. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. Has it? I sat down across from them, noting the way Carlos's hand rested near his jacket pocket. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like everything went exactly according to plan. Carlos leaned forward, his accent more pronounced when he was stressed. Listen, Marcus, we know you're upset about the property situation, but we can work something out. Maybe a financial settlement that compensates you for your inconvenience. Inconvenience? I kept my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. You forged my signature on legal documents, stole my inheritance, and used my identity to commit federal fraud. That's not an inconvenience. That's a crime spree. Jessica's composure cracked slightly. We didn't have a choice. Carlos's business was failing, and we needed the property as collateral. We were going to pay you back once things stabilized. With what money? Your import business is hemorrhaging cash, and you've been using my grandmother's house as a distribution center for whatever you're really importing. The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos and Jessica exchanged a look that confirmed everything the federal prosecutors suspected. This wasn't just about property theft. I don't know what you think you saw, Carlos said carefully, but my import business is completely legitimate, all properly documented through customs. Is that why you're planning to sell the property to buyers in Mexico City? To keep your legitimate business running? Jessica's face went pale. How do you know about that? Because I've been watching, Jess. I've been listening to your phone calls, monitoring your financial transfers, and documenting every crime you've committed using my name. Carlos stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This conversation is over. Sit down, Carlos. My voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. We're not finished. Actually, we are. Jessica's voice was cold now, all pretense of family affection abandoned. You want to know the truth, Marcus? Fine. We took the property because we needed it. We forged your signature because you were never coming back anyway. You chose the military over your family, and families take care of their own. Even if it means committing federal crimes? Even if it means doing whatever necessary to survive. Carlos had sat back down, but his hand remained near his jacket. Your grandmother's house was just sitting empty while we struggled to keep our businesses afloat. We put it to good use. Good use like storing imported merchandise that doesn't appear on any customs manifests? The trap had been set perfectly, and they'd walked directly into it. Carlos's face flushed with anger as he realized I knew far more than they'd anticipated. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. This isn't just about property or business loans. There are people involved who don't accept interference gracefully. Is that a threat? It's a warning, Walk away from this, Marcus. Take whatever settlement we offer and disappear. Some fights aren't worth winning. Jessica leaned across the table, her eyes pleading. Please, Marcus. I know we made mistakes, but we're still family. Don't destroy us over money. This isn't about money anymore, Jess. It's about justice. You stole my identity, forged federal documents, and turned my grandmother's house into a criminal enterprise. There are consequences for choices like that. Consequences? Carlos laughed bitterly. You want to talk about consequences? Your little investigation has put people at risk. Important people who don't like their business arrangements exposed. Agent Rodriguez's voice crackled in my earpiece. That's enough. We have what we need. Get out of there now. But before I could stand up, Carlos's phone buzzed with an urgent message. He read it quickly, his face going from angry to terrified in the span of seconds. We need to leave. Now. He grabbed Jessica's arm, pulling her toward the exit. What's wrong? She asked, confusion replacing the calculated coldness she'd shown moments before. Federal agents are at the house. They have search warrants. The cafe erupted into chaos as Jessica realized the full implications of what Carlos had just said. Federal search warrants meant federal charges. Federal charges meant prison sentences that would destroy their carefully constructed lives. This is your fault, she screamed at me, her composure completely shattered. You called the FBI. You destroyed our family over money. I destroyed your criminal enterprise over justice, I corrected, standing up as federal agents entered the cafe from multiple entrances. There's a difference. Agent Rodriguez approached our table with his badge displayed, followed by 4 other agents who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this thousands of times before. Carlos Martinez. Jessica Thompson Martinez. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and violation of federal immigration statutes. The handcuffs clicked with a finality that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet cafe. Other patrons watched in fascination as 2 people who'd appeared to be successful professionals were led away in restraints. Marcus, Jessica called out as they reached the door. This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started. But I did know. I'd started the process of justice that should have begun 3 years ago when they first forged my signature. I'd exposed a criminal conspiracy that had used my family name to commit federal crimes. And I'd proven that even the most carefully planned betrayal would eventually face consequences. Agent Rodriguez stayed behind as his team escorted Jessica and Carlos to the federal detention center. Outstanding work, Marcus. Their confessions, combined with the evidence we've already collected, will put them away for decades. What about my parents? Arrest warrants will be issued within the hour. Based on the communications we intercepted, they were active participants in the conspiracy from the beginning. Amanda appeared beside me, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who'd worked around the clock to build a federal case. The property seizure is complete. The house is now under federal control as evidence in a criminal investigation. Once the case is resolved, the court will restore your legal ownership. And the import business? Shut down permanently. The warehouse contained enough contraband to support additional charges under the Controlled Substances Act. Carlos wasn't just importing legitimate merchandise. He was running drugs through your grandmother's house. The scope of their betrayal continued to expand even as justice closed in around them. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd turned my family legacy into a drug distribution center that put the entire neighborhood at risk. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. Perimeter secure. Secondary arrests in progress. Your parents are in custody. I walked outside the cafe into the Phoenix heat, feeling the weight of months of investigation finally lifting from my shoulders. Federal agents were swarming the scene, but the chaos felt organized, purposeful. Justice in motion. Riley joined me on the sidewalk, her expression showing the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. Electronic surveillance confirmed 12 international conspirators, 6 shell companies, and financial transfers totaling over $8 million. This isn't just a family fraud case anymore. It's an international criminal enterprise, How long before trials begin? Federal. Prosecutors are fast-tracking the case. With their recorded confessions and the evidence we've collected, they'll probably plead guilty to avoid life sentences. Your family will be looking at federal prison terms ranging from 10 to 30 years. As federal agents continued their work around us, I found myself thinking about my grandmother Elena. She'd raised me to understand the difference between right and wrong, to value honor over convenience, and to stand up for justice even when it cost everything. She would have been proud that I'd fought for the truth. She would have been heartbroken that fighting for the truth meant destroying the family she'd tried so hard to hold together. Amanda touched my shoulder gently. The court will schedule a hearing to restore your property rights within 30 days. Your grandmother's house will be returned to you once the federal evidence collection is complete. What about the damage they've done to it? The federal seizure inventory documents everything. You'll be entitled to full restoration costs, plus damages for the years of illegal occupation. Agent Rodriguez approached us, his phone pressed to his ear, as he coordinated with federal prosecutors. When he finished his call, his expression was grimly satisfied. The U.S. Attorney's Office is filing charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO charges carry enhanced penalties for criminal enterprises. Your family won't be eligible for parole for at least 15 years. 15 years. The number echoed in my mind as I watched federal agents loading evidence boxes into their vehicles. Jessica would be in her 50s when she got out of prison. Carlos would be nearly 60. My parents would likely die behind bars. They'd chosen this path when they decided that my military service made me expendable, that my sacrifice for my country meant I didn't deserve the inheritance my grandmother had left me. They'd chosen this path when they forged my signature and turned my family legacy into a criminal enterprise. But even knowing they deserved every consequence that was coming to them, I felt no satisfaction in their destruction. Only the hollow satisfaction of justice served, and the bitter knowledge that some betrayals can never be forgiven or forgotten. 6 months later, I stood in the restored garden of my grandmother's house, watching the sun set over the Sonoran Desert. The federal investigation had concluded with guilty pleas from all 4 family members. Jessica and Carlos had received 25-year sentences. My parents had accepted 15-year terms in exchange for their cooperation. The house had been completely renovated, with all traces of their criminal enterprise removed. The rose garden was blooming again, and the fountain they'd installed with stolen money had been replaced with a simple bench where I could sit and remember better times. Jake and Riley visited occasionally, and Amanda had become more than just my lawyer. She'd become a friend who understood the cost of fighting for justice when family becomes the enemy. I never spoke to my parents or Jessica again. They'd sent letters from federal prison asking for forgiveness, trying to explain their choices, begging for understanding. I'd burned every letter without reading them completely. Some betrayals are too deep for reconciliation. Some choices can't be undone with apologies. But justice had been served, and my grandmother's legacy had been restored. In the end, that was enough. The Desert Moon Cafe had closed down 6 months after the arrests, unable to recover from the negative publicity of hosting federal takedowns. In its place, a new restaurant had opened, a small family business run by Iraqi refugees who understood the value of second chances and honest work. I ate there sometimes, sitting at the same table where Jessica and Carlos had confessed their crimes while wearing a federal wire. The new owners had no idea about the cafe's history, and I never told them. Some stories are better left buried, but some truths are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Even when the enemy wears your family's face and speaks with voices you once trusted, justice remains justice. Honor remains honor. And sometimes, the quiet satisfaction of doing the right thing is the only victory that matters. The sun finished setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of safer times. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve something larger than myself. But tonight, I sat in my grandmother's garden, surrounded by roses she'd planted and memories she'd nurtured, knowing that her legacy was finally safe. And that was enough. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.